I'm personally not a huge fan of importing the context directly and then calling react.useContext wherever I need to access that context. I'd much prefer the ability to just call a hook and get the data and not care about where exactly it's coming from. In addition to that, if I don't put this authenticated app inside of the context provider, then I'm going to get a funny looking error message saying something about not being able to destructure from undefined. So what I'm going to do instead is we're going to make a hook here called useAuth to consume this auth context. We're actually going to do the same thing that we're doing over here, except instead of destructuring this, we'll just call this context. And then we can say, hey, if this context is undefined, then we'll throw a new error that useAuth must be used within a auth context provider. And if their context does exist, then we know that they are using it with an auth context provider, so we can just return the context value. And now we can export that useAuth, and then instead of importing the auth context to consume that context, we can actually just import the useAuth and call that function directly. So let's try that right here. We'll call useAuth. Let's come up here and import useAuth instead. And it looks like we no longer need React here. We'll save that and then come over here. Instead of auth context, we'll do useAuth and come right down here, call useAuth right there. And then for our books, we can find all the places where we're saying React use context and call useAuth instead, and then bring in useAuth here. And then finally for our list items, we'll do exactly the same thing. And we'll bring in useAuth there. So with that, now we've protected ourselves against accidentally rendering something outside of the authentication context and getting some weird error message, and the error message we'll get instead is nice and clear. In addition, we no longer need to use the React use context ourselves. Instead, we simply call useAuth and we get the auth context. So let's make sure that that's still working. And it looks like we are able to make authenticated requests, so things are looking good. In review, what we did here is we made a function called useAuth, which consumes the auth context that we created right here. If that context is not defined, then that means we're using this hook outside of the auth context provider, which is a problem. So we'll give a nice error message to explain what the problem is. Otherwise, we can simply return the context. And then everywhere that we were using React use context, auth context, we instead use this useAuth hook. And that's an easier way for our consumers to consume this context value.